In January 2011, a polar vortex pushed temperatures across Taos County to 18 degrees below zero. Furnaces ran around the clock. Propane bills hit $800 in a single month. Inside Kirsten Jakobsen's home, the thermostat read 64 degrees. Her heating bill, zero, not reduced. Zero, no furnace, no backup heater. Just 800 automobile tires packed with earth, absorbing sunlight and releasing warmth through the coldest nights. The county had tried to shut these buildings down. The state had stripped the architect's license. Engineers called his methods dangerous. Neighbors called them eyesores. But the walls didn't care what anyone called them. They just kept working. This is the story of Michael Reynolds. Outside, the high desert wind pushed against the glass, 23 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that cracks pipes and sends propane bills spiraling past $200 a month. Across Taos County, furnaces kicked on. Space heaters glowed orange. Neighbors layered blankets over blankets and checked the weather forecast for relief that wouldn't come for days. Inside the house made of garbage, Michael Reynolds walked barefoot down a hallway lined with banana trees. The thermostat read 68 degrees. It had read 68 degrees yesterday. It would read 68 degrees tomorrow. No furnace, no propane tank, no heating bill arriving in the mailbox. Just 800 automobile tires packed with 300 pounds of earth each, absorbing the sun's warmth through south-facing glass and releasing it slowly through the coldest nights. The walls themselves were batteries, charged by sunlight, discharging comfort while the mesa froze. The county had tried to shut him down. The state had stripped his license. Engineers had called his methods dangerous. Neighbors had called them eyesores. The planning director had threatened $500 a day in fines and sent the sheriff with a warrant for his arrest. That was a decade ago. Now the New Mexico legislature had passed a law specifically to protect what Reynolds built. The American Institute of Architects had invited him to lecture at their headquarters. His garbage houses sold for $500,000 and attracted buyers from Europe, Asia, and South America. The homes he'd been forbidden to build dotted the mesa in every direction, over 100 of them, sheltering families through winters that would bankrupt their neighbors in heating costs alone. But 37 years earlier, none of this existed. There was only a young architect who'd just quit his job in London, a television broadcast about trash, and an idea so radical that everyone he told about it assumed he'd lost his mind. In 1970, Michael Reynolds sat in his rented room in Taos, New Mexico, watching Walter Cronkite deliver the evening news. Reynolds was 24 years old, fresh out of architecture school at the University of Cincinnati, and already certain that everything he'd learned was wrong. The broadcast showed aerial footage of clear-cut forests, thousands of acres stripped bare to feed the housing industry. Mountainsides that had been green for centuries now lay exposed, the soil washing into rivers, the wildlife scattered. Then came images of roadsides choked with aluminum cans, beverage containers piling up faster than anyone could collect them, glinting in sunlight like metallic weeds. Two problems, two waste streams, two environmental disasters unfolding simultaneously, while architects kept designing houses that required both. Timber for frames, metal for components, all of it extracted, processed, assembled, and heading eventually to landfills. Reynolds had spent 5 years studying how to build conventional structures. He'd learned to calculate loads and specify materials and draft elevations that satisfied codes. Now, watching Cronkite, he asked a question that would consume the next 5 decades of his life. What if the trash was the solution? He'd already rejected the conventional path. A co-op position at a London architecture firm during his studies had lasted exactly 2 weeks before Reynolds quit, bought a motorcycle, and rode it to Africa. The work had been, in his words, super boring. Drafting elevations for buildings designed to consume resources and depend on infrastructure struck him as professionally legitimate and personally pointless. He wanted to build things that mattered, things that solved problems rather than perpetuating them. Taos had drawn him initially for motocross racing. Yamaha sponsored him, and the high desert offered terrain that tested both rider and machine. But the mesa offered something else too. Cheap land, minimal building codes, space to experiment without neighbors close enough to complain. At 7,000 feet, the air was thin, the sun was intense 300 days a year, and the winters were brutal enough to test anything a builder might try. If a design worked in Taos, it could work almost anywhere. His father had been a hoarder of materials, bottle caps, jars, cans, anything that might prove useful someday. The habit had seemed eccentric when Reynolds was young, maybe even embarrassing. Now it felt prophetic. "He saved everything," Reynolds recalled. "It made an impression on me, I suppose, because now I see those same things and I use them in buildings." Where others saw garbage waiting for disposal, Reynolds had been trained since childhood to see raw material waiting for purpose. His first attempt came in 1972. Reynolds collected beer cans from local bars, hundreds of them, empties that would otherwise have gone to landfills or lined roadsides. He mortared them together like bricks, laying them horizontally with their ends exposed, filling the cavities with concrete. The structure looked rough, more sculpture than building, the kind of thing that made passers-by slow their trucks to stare. The neighbours didn't know what to make of it. Neither did the few architects who heard about the project and drove out to see for themselves. But it stood. The cans filled with concrete created surprisingly sturdy walls. Reynolds called it the thumb house for its shape, a single curved room that rose from the desert floor like a hitchhiker's gesture. It wasn't a home, it wasn't meant to be. It was a proof of concept, an experiment in materials that cost nothing because nobody else wanted them. The following year he filed for a patent. United States patent 3,721,059, a building block made from spent beverage cans bound with cement. The patent examiner in Washington reviewed the application, requested clarifications, and ultimately approved it. Reynolds now held legal protection for an idea most architects would have dismissed as a joke, or worse, as an insult to the profession. But cans had limitations. They provided structure, not thermal mass. Reynolds needed walls that could store heat from the intense desert sun and release it through frigid nights. Walls that would turn the building itself into a battery, charged during the day, discharging through darkness. The solution came from an even more maligned waste stream: automobile tires. The United States was drowning in discarded tires. 2.5 billion sat in stockpiles across the country, mountains of rubber rising beside highways and behind warehouses, growing faster than anyone could count. Another 2.5 million joined them every year. They didn't biodegrade. They couldn't be easily recycled. The rubber resisted breakdown for centuries. Worse, the stockpiles bred mosquitoes in their collected rainwater and caught fire in blazes that burned for months, sending toxic smoke across counties and poisoning groundwater with runoff. Every municipality in America was paying to store them, and nobody knew what to do with them. Reynolds knew exactly what to do with them. A tire filled with rammed earth weighed roughly 300 pounds. The rubber contained the soil like a permanent form. Stacked in courses like oversized bricks, plastered over with adobe, and backed with an earthen berm, the tires created walls more than 2 feet thick. Walls with thermal mass comparable to traditional adobe, but requiring no skilled labor to build. A person with a sledgehammer and a shovel could pound out 4 tires an hour. No wooden forms, no curing time. No expertise beyond the willingness to swing until your shoulders burned and your hands blistered. In 1979, Reynolds completed his first tire-based structure. He called it the Hobbit House for the way it nestled into the earth, its curved walls emerging from the hillside like something organic, like it had grown there rather than been built. The design was crude by later standards, the finish rough in places, the systems still primitive. But the principle worked. Even in January, when temperatures outside plunged below zero, the interior stayed comfortable without external heat. The walls absorbed sunlight, the walls released warmth, the tire house breathed. Reynolds began sketching larger designs, homes that would harvest their own rainwater from metal roofs and store it in buried cisterns. Homes that would grow food indoors year-round in solar-heated greenhouses integrated into the living space. Homes that would treat their own sewage through botanical systems, plants that fed on waste and purified water. Homes that needed nothing from the grid, no water lines, no sewer connections, no power company, no monthly bills of any kind. He called the concept biotecture. Not architecture, which he felt had become about buildings and about architects, but biotecture, designed for living systems. His mentor, he told anyone who would listen, was a tree. A tree needed no infrastructure. Its leaves collected energy from sunlight. Its roots found water wherever water hid. It processed its own waste and returned nutrients to the soil. It sheltered countless organisms without requiring anything from the outside world. Reynolds wanted to build houses that worked the same way, vessels that could sustain human life by encountering the planet's natural phenomena directly. By 1987, he'd constructed his first commercial Earthship, the term he'd started using a year earlier to describe what these buildings actually were. Not houses in the conventional sense, ships for Earth, vessels for survival. The cost came to $17 per square foot, a fraction of conventional construction. The buyer got a structure that would heat itself through Taos winters and cool itself through summers, fed by nothing but sunlight passing through glass. But not everyone was impressed. The New Mexico Board of Examiners for Architects received its first formal complaint in 1988. The client alleged a leaking roof. Water had found its way through seams that should have been sealed, dripping onto floors during monsoon season, pooling where pooling meant damage. Another complaint followed within the year, this one citing a solar composting toilet that had failed to function as promised. The system was supposed to break down waste without water or chemicals. Instead, it had produced odors and mess that made the bathroom unusable. Then came reports of cost overruns. Projects that Reynolds had estimated at one figure had ballooned to another, leaving clients scrambling for financing they hadn't anticipated. Then accusations of inadequate climate control in an early prototype. A home that overheated in summer, turning afternoons into saunas despite the design's supposed passive cooling. The board began investigating Michael Reynolds. The complaints weren't frivolous. Reynolds was experimenting, and experiments sometimes failed. Early Earthship designs had genuine problems that would take years to solve. Roofs that worked perfectly in theory sometimes leaked in practice, especially in the Southwest's violent summer thunderstorms, when rain fell faster than any drainage system could handle. Systems designed for passive heating occasionally overheated because Reynolds hadn't yet calculated the precise angles for summer shading. The botanical sewage cells required precise balancing, the right microbes, the right plant species, the right flow rates, and Reynolds was still figuring out the formulas through trial and error. He was learning as he built. His clients bore the cost of that education. Some bore it willingly, understanding they were pioneers. Others felt they'd been promised a finished product and delivered a prototype. Shauna Malloy, the attorney representing the Architects Board, summarized the issue in terms any professional would understand. Standardized design and construction is so important because it means safety, she explained. Buildings needed to follow codes because codes existed for reasons. Decades of engineering had established what worked, what failed, what killed people when it collapsed. Lives depended on predictability. Innovation might sound exciting in magazines and at conferences, but innovation meant risk, and the people assuming that risk were often homeowners who didn't fully understand what they'd agreed to, not the architect who walked away when the project was done. Reynolds couldn't argue that his methods were safe by conventional standards. They weren't conventional. No code anywhere in America addressed tire walls. No manual covered greywater botanical cells. No inspection protocol existed for homes that treated their own sewage indoors, that collected their own rainwater, that generated their own electricity. Every Earthship was, by definition, an experiment, and experiments, by definition, sometimes failed. In 1990, rather than face formal malpractice charges that could result in fines or worse, Reynolds surrendered his New Mexico architecture license voluntarily. The board accepted the surrender. The investigation closed without prosecution. Reynolds was no longer a licensed architect in the state where he'd spent 2 decades developing his methods, where all his buildings stood, where his entire professional identity had formed. He would remain unlicensed for 17 years. But losing his license didn't stop him from building. It stopped him from legally calling himself an architect in New Mexico. It stopped him from stamping drawings with a professional seal. It stopped him from bidding on jobs that required licensure or signing contracts that specified licensed professionals. But nothing in the law prevented a person from constructing experimental buildings on their own land, or from selling plans and guidance to others who wanted to try the same approach on theirs. Reynolds kept building. He established Greater World, a 630-acre community 14 miles northwest of Taos, where people could purchase land and construct Earthships under his guidance. 347 acres were designated permanent greenbelt, land that could never be developed, that would remain desert and sage forever. The rest was platted for 130 home sites, each large enough for an Earthship and its systems, each positioned for optimal solar gain. He created Reach, a 55-acre site near the village of Valdez, tucked into the foothills where the mesa met the mountains. He developed Star, 1,100 acres of high plateau designated for sustainable development, the largest project yet, ambitious enough to demonstrate that his methods could scale from individual homes to entire communities. Families moved in, structures went up, the community grew one tire at a time. The work itself was punishing. Reynolds didn't supervise from a distance, clipboard in hand, watching others labor. He pounded tires alongside his crew, 8 hours a day under the high desert sun, swinging an 8-pound sledgehammer until his shoulders burned and his palms bled through their calluses. The rhythm became meditation. Swing, impact, swing, impact. The dirt compressed, the tire bulged firm. Move to the next one. Each tire required 3 to 4 wheelbarrows of moist earth, shoveled in and compacted to 95% density. A 2-person team, 1 shoveling, 1 pounding, could finish 4 tires per hour if they worked without stopping, without conversation, without breaks except to drink water. A typical Earthship needed 800 to 900 tires for its exterior walls alone. That meant over 200 hours of tire pounding, 42 days of continuous labor just for the walls, not counting the interior systems, the glazing, the roofing, the finish work. The process was simple enough that anyone could learn it in an afternoon. Reynolds held workshops teaching newcomers the technique. Swing from the shoulders, not the arms. Keep the sledgehammer perpendicular, pack the edges first, then work toward the center in a spiral. Check the compaction by standing on the finished tire. If it flexed underfoot, keep pounding. The method required no skill, only endurance and tolerance for monotony. That was the point. Reynolds wanted to democratize construction, to make building accessible to people who couldn't afford contractors, didn't trust them, or simply wanted to build their own shelter with their own hands. After the tire walls came the can walls. Interior partitions didn't need thermal mass, they just needed to divide space and support shelving and provide something to hang pictures on. Aluminum cans laid horizontally in concrete worked perfectly, strong, light, available by the thousands from any recycling center or the dumpsters behind any bar. A standard Earthship incorporated roughly 10,000 cans in its interior walls. Reynolds paid workers to collect them or accepted donations from locals happy to see their trash put to use rather than trucked to landfills. Then came the bottle walls, glass bottles, cobalt blue from wine, green from beer, amber from medicine bottles, were cut in half with a wet tile saw, the bottoms joined with silicone to form translucent cylinders. Set vertically in mortar, they transmitted light while providing privacy and insulation. The effect was stunning, walls that glowed like stained glass when the sun hit them, kaleidoscopes of color for essentially zero material cost. Around 2,000 bottles went into each home, transforming what would have been landfill waste into something approaching art. The water systems proved more complex. Taos County received only 8 to 12 inches of precipitation annually, barely enough to sustain crops, let alone households with showers and toilets. But Reynolds calculated that a properly designed roof could capture more than enough for a family's needs. Each inch of rain per square foot of metal roofing yielded roughly 0.6 of a gallon. A 2,000 square foot roof in a year of 10 inches of rain could collect 12,000 gallons. Store it in buried cisterns, concrete or fiberglass tanks set below the frost line, filter it through sediment traps and carbon beds, and you had drinking water cleaner than most municipal supplies. No well to drill, no municipal connection to pay for, no monthly bill arriving in the mailbox. But 12,000 gallons wasn't enough for conventional American water use. The average household consumed 100 gallons daily, washing machines, dishwashers, long showers, toilets flushed after every use. Over 36,000 gallons per year. Reynolds needed to stretch each gallon 3 times further than normal. His solution was serial reuse. Water from the cistern went first to sinks, showers, and washing machines, what engineers called potable uses. The resulting grey water, clouded with soap and organic matter, flowed into botanical cells built into the living space. These were 36-inch deep planters lined with EPDM rubber membrane, filled with layers of gravel, sand and soil, and planted with species that thrived on nutrient-rich waste. banana trees, bird of paradise, ferns that unfurled toward the south-facing glass. The plants drank the water, microbes in the gravel consumed the organic matter. What emerged, collected in a secondary cistern, was clear enough to flush toilets, and flushing accounted for 40% of household water use. The toilet water, now called black water, flowed to a solar-heated septic tank buried outside for anaerobic digestion. From there, the treated effluent irrigated ET cells, evapotranspiration planters that watered fruit trees and berry brambles in the outdoor landscape. Nothing left the property. Every gallon served 4 purposes before returning to the earth. The systems worked, but making them work had required 15 years of refinement. The botanical cells needed the right plant species in the right proportions. Too many heavy feeders and the system starved. Too few and nutrients accumulated until the water turned foul. The grey water had to flow at precisely the right rate. Too fast and filtration failed. Too slow and the system backed up into sinks. The septic tank required proper sizing based on household occupancy. Each component was straightforward in isolation. Integrating them into a functioning whole that worked year after year without professional maintenance demanded constant experimentation. By 1997, Reynolds had facilitated the construction of dozens of Earthships across his 3 developments. He'd written 3 volumes explaining his methods in detail: Earthship, How to Build Your Own; Earthship, Systems and Components; and Earthship, Evolution Beyond Economics, selling them through mail order and at alternative building conferences where he'd become a regular speaker. People travelled from across the country to see what he'd created. Journalists arrived with cameras and notebooks. Some visitors called Reynolds a visionary, a prophet of sustainable living. The county called him something else entirely. Dave DiCicco had just been appointed Taos County Planning Director when he drove out to inspect Reynolds' developments in the fall of 1997. What he found alarmed him, not the buildings themselves, those were impressive enough in their strange way, but the infrastructure around them, or rather, the absence of infrastructure. As far as we're concerned, Mr. Reynolds has created 3 illegal subdivisions, DiCicco announced after his inspection. He's violated the New Mexico Subdivision Act, the Taos County Land Use Regulations, and the Uniform Building Code. The specific violations piled up in DiCicco's report. No proper road access for emergency vehicles. The paths between home sites were dirt tracks that washed out in rainstorms, not roads graded and gravelled to county specifications. No floodplain data. Reynolds hadn't commissioned the hydrological studies that would determine which sites might be inundated in a 100-year storm. No soil assessments. No geotechnical reports certifying that the ground could support the structures built on it. No water use projections demonstrating that the aquifer could sustain additional wells if the rainwater systems failed. The roads were particularly damning. What Reynolds called access routes were erosion channels, gullies carved by seasonal runoff that sometimes remained passable in dry weather and sometimes swallowed vehicles to their axles when the ground was wet. Building sites sat at the end of these gullies with no alternative routes in or out. DiCicco didn't see sustainable innovation. He saw liability. He saw families living in structures that no inspector had certified, at the end of roads that no fire truck could navigate, with sewage systems that no health department had approved. He saw accidents waiting to happen and lawsuits waiting to be filed, all of it landing eventually on the county's desk. This isn't the Wild West anymore, DiCicco told reporters, and we can't afford to be casual. Anytime you're talking about bringing 100 families to the valley, no matter what type of house they live in, it's going to have an impact on the county. He issued stop work orders covering all 3 developments. Code enforcement teams drove out to Greater World, to Reach, to Star, and red-tagged houses under construction, affixing fluorescent orange stickers to doors and windows that warned workers and owners alike. The buildings were violations. Work must cease immediately. The county warned that continued construction would result in fines of $500 per day per structure. The district attorney's office prepared misdemeanor charges against Reynolds for ignoring previous orders. The sheriff's department issued a warrant for his arrest for violating a stop work order, not a figurative threat but an actual warrant, paper filed with the court, authorizing deputies to take Michael Reynolds into custody. The warrant meant Reynolds could be arrested if he set foot on certain properties he himself had developed. It meant his crew members could face charges for following his instructions. It meant families who'd invested their savings in sustainable homes might see those homes condemned, demolished or seized. Everything Reynolds had built over 25 years hung in legal limbo, subject to shutdown, demolition, or forced sale at the county's discretion. Reynolds had spent a quarter-century trying to solve problems that most people hadn't yet recognized as problems. Now the full weight of local government pressed against him. The neighbors pressed too. Jeff Bryce sat on the Valdez Acequia Commission, the governing body that managed the ancient irrigation system feeding the valley's farms. His family had lived in the shadow of the mesa for generations, long before Reynolds arrived, long before anyone had thought to build houses out of tires. Bryce had watched the Earthship community grow from a single oddity to an expanding settlement. He'd watched the dirt roads deteriorate under traffic they were never designed to carry. He'd watched strangers move into the valley, people who didn't understand the acequias or the traditions or the seasonal rhythms of life in northern New Mexico. In my opinion, Bryce told a reporter from High Country News, Michael Reynolds' project above Valdez is the greatest violation of land ever done in the Taos Valley. The words carried weight. Bryce wasn't a bureaucrat enforcing regulations from a distant office. He wasn't a stranger with no stake in the outcome. He was a local, born and raised in the valley, speaking for families who'd farmed this land since Spanish colonial times. His concern wasn't abstract theory about building codes or professional licensing. He could see the earthships from his property. He could hear the construction, the rhythmic pounding of sledgehammers that carried across the mesa. He could feel the community changing in ways that felt unstoppable. Connie Espinosa, the Valdez postmaster, had similar concerns. "You can see that glass and stuff shining from a great distance," she said, "and I think it's ugly and inappropriate." The Earthship's most distinctive feature, a south-facing wall of angled glass that captured solar heat and sheltered indoor growing beds, meant they were visible for miles across the high desert. Sunlight reflected off them in the afternoons like signals, like beacons announcing that something different was happening here. Traditional adobe blended into the landscape, its earth tones matching the desert floor. The Earthships didn't blend. They gleamed. They announced themselves whether the neighbors wanted to see them or not. Beverly Armijo owned a business in Taos proper. Her objection wasn't aesthetic. It was about fairness, about the rules that everyone else had to follow. "Reynolds is trying to save Mother Earth and all that," she said, "but he's exploiting the rest of us. If we're forced to abide by regulations, so should he." The argument cut deep because it was essentially correct. Local builders had to pull permits for every project, pay fees, wait weeks for approval, revise plans according to inspector feedback. Local developers had to submit engineering studies, post bonds against failure, navigate a process designed to be slow and deliberate. Local homeowners couldn't add a bathroom without county review. Reynolds appeared to operate outside those constraints, not because the law exempted him, but because his methods were so unconventional that the system hadn't caught up. The codes didn't address tire walls, the inspectors didn't understand botanical sewage cells. So Reynolds built while everyone else waited in line. Even some of Reynolds' own clients had complaints. Joey Townsend had purchased land in Reach and built an Earthship there with his own hands, following Reynolds' plans and guidance. The structure worked exactly as promised. The walls kept temperature stable through summer and winter. The water systems collected rain and recycled waste. Townsend was living sustainably, off-grid, independent. What didn't work was getting to his home. "I have no road access to my Earthship," Townsend told reporters. "I have a gully. I've already replaced the transmission on my truck just trying to get there." The gullies weren't roads in any legal or practical sense. They were erosion channels carved by centuries of runoff, paths of least resistance that water had established and vehicles now followed. In dry weather, with careful driving, they were passable. After a thunderstorm, they became rivers of mud that could strand a truck for days. In winter, when snow drifted and froze, they disappeared entirely under white dunes. Reynolds had laid out the developments with sustainability in mind, minimizing infrastructure, keeping the land as natural as possible, preserving the landscape rather than scarring it with asphalt that would last centuries. The unintended result meant that emergency vehicles couldn't reach some sites at all. Fire trucks couldn't navigate the terrain. An ambulance responding to a medical crisis, a heart attack, a stroke, a severed artery from a construction accident would get stuck a quarter mile from its destination. These weren't trivial concerns, they were exactly the concerns that building codes and subdivision regulations existed to address. People had died in other jurisdictions because emergency services couldn't reach them in time. The county's caution wasn't bureaucratic obstruction for its own sake, it was caution learned from tragedy. Then came Suzanne Martin. Martin had purchased an Earthship in 1998, expecting the sustainable home Reynolds books described in loving detail. She'd read all 3 volumes, she'd studied the photographs, she'd absorbed the philosophy, she'd invested her savings in a structure that was supposed to free her from utility companies, from mortgage anxiety, from dependence on systems that could fail. What she received, according to her lawsuit, was something else entirely. The roof leaked. Water pooled in areas where water was never supposed to collect, seeping through seams that should have been waterproof, dripping onto floors during the summer monsoons that the design should have harvested rather than admitted. The cisterns that were supposed to store that harvested water malfunctioned, tanks that didn't fill properly, pumps that failed, filtration that clogged with sediment. The electrical system, wired by workers who learned on the job, ran exposed in places where it should have been hidden, looking less like a finished home than an abandoned construction site. And the solar composting toilets, the system Reynolds promoted as eliminating the need for conventional sewage, as turning human waste into garden fertilizer through natural decomposition, failed to compost at all. The waste accumulated rather than breaking down. Odors permeated the bathroom and beyond. The system that was supposed to represent freedom from municipal sewage became instead a source of daily disgust. Her attorney, Lorenzo Atencio, documented the defects methodically. He hired inspectors to photograph the problems. He obtained estimates for repairs. He compiled the evidence into a complaint alleging violation of the New Mexico Unfair Trade Practices Act, that Reynolds had misrepresented what buyers would receive, had promised one thing and delivered another. The complaint also alleged breach of contract, that the structure didn't meet the specifications laid out in the purchase agreement. The case proceeded through the courts. The judge heard testimony from Martin, from Reynolds, from experts on both sides. He examined the photographic evidence, the contracts, the promotional materials. In 2003, he ruled in Martin's favor. Reynolds faced a choice: appeal the ruling and risk a larger judgment, or settle. He agreed to buy back the property rather than continue fighting. The settlement, combined with legal fees from the Martin case and other disputes that had accumulated over the years, had drained roughly $500,000 from Reynolds and his company. Money earned one Earthship at a time, one workshop fee at a time, one book sale at a time, gone to lawyers, to judgments, to a client whose home had failed to perform. His license was already surrendered. His developments faced shutdown orders. His neighbors condemned him. The county wanted him in jail. The documentary crew that had been following Reynolds through this period captured something unexpected. Reynolds sat alone in an unfinished structure, tire walls rising around him, the late afternoon light slanting through unglazed window openings. He talked about depression, the weight of it, the financial ruin, the legal battles, the professional disgrace, the widening gap between what he'd envisioned and what reality kept delivering had become crushing. "That stretch of hard times lightened my pack," he said later, "and I'll never fill it up again." He had built structures that worked. He had proven concepts that no one else had attempted. He had demonstrated that houses could heat themselves without furnaces, could collect their own water, could treat their own waste. But the structures that failed had consequences, and those consequences were destroying him. The permitting offices saw him as a menace. The engineering profession saw him as a disgrace. Reynolds described their perception in terms that spared no dignity. "I was building these things out of garbage, containing sewage. The permitting officers and engineers thought of me as a turd in the punch bowl." He had 2 choices: surrender, sell the land, pay the fines, accept the court judgments, walk away, find some other work, let the Earthships become curiosities and footnotes, relics of a failed experiment by a discredited architect who dreamed larger than he could execute. Or fight on a battlefield where his opponents controlled the ground, wrote the rules, and had already demonstrated their willingness to use every weapon available. Reynolds chose to fight, but not with lawyers this time, not with protests or petitions, not with civil disobedience that would only generate more warrants. He went to the New Mexico State Legislature. In November 2004, Michael Reynolds walked into the Roundhouse in Santa Fe, the distinctive circular building that housed New Mexico's state government, and requested meetings with legislators he'd never met. He was 59 years old, unlicensed, under legal threat, and carrying an argument that sounded absurd on its face. New Mexico, he pointed out, was the state that had detonated the first atomic bomb. Los Alamos had blown up 10,000 acres of desert in 1945 in the interest of national security. The Trinity test had irradiated land for generations, had killed livestock downwind, had poisoned aquifers with radioactive runoff, had created a wasteland where nothing would grow for centuries. All of it had been permitted, approved, celebrated as necessary sacrifice for American progress and security. So why can't we test housing? Reynolds asked. The legislators exchanged glances. Some smiled politely. A few seemed to suppress laughter. Housing wasn't a matter of national security. Building codes existed for public safety, to prevent houses from collapsing on their occupants, to ensure emergency access, to protect public health from improperly treated sewage. The system worked. It had evolved over decades to address exactly the kinds of problems Reynolds' projects created. Reynolds' problems weren't the system's fault. They were his own. They laughed him off. Politely, professionally, but thoroughly. Reynolds left that first round of meetings with nothing but a promise, made only to himself, to return. He'd spent 25 years learning how to build differently. He would spend the next 3 years learning how to lobby. He returned the following legislative session with refined arguments. He brought data, temperature logs recorded over entire winters showing interior stability, utility bills showing zero heating costs while neighbors paid hundreds monthly. He brought testimonials from Earthship owners who'd weathered blizzards without discomfort. He brought photographs of the communities thriving on the mesa despite every obstacle the county had thrown at them. The legislators listened more carefully, some asked questions, some requested follow-up materials, some introduced Reynolds to colleagues who served on relevant committees. None committed to sponsoring legislation, but the doors didn't close quite as quickly. Reynolds returned the year after that, and the year after that. Each session, his network grew. Each session, his arguments sharpened. Meanwhile, the Earthships kept performing, and the performance data kept accumulating. At Greater World, homeowners tracked their utility bills with the precision of scientists documenting an ongoing experiment. The numbers told a story that no argument could match. Conventional homes in Taos County spent an average of $215 monthly on heating through winter, propane, natural gas, electricity, whatever fuel their furnaces required. Earthship owners spent nothing on heating. Their structures maintained temperatures between 65 and 75 degrees through the coldest months, powered by nothing but sunlight passing through south-facing glass. 800 tires packed with Earth-absorbed solar radiation through the day. The thermal mass, over 200,000 pounds of material in the walls of a typical Earthship, stored that energy the way a battery stores charge. At night, when temperatures outside plunged below zero, the walls released their warmth slowly through conduction, keeping interiors stable while the mesa froze. The south-facing orientation maximized solar gain during winter, when the sun rode low on the horizon and passed through the angled glass at optimal angles. In summer, when the sun climbed higher, strategic overhangs blocked direct radiation, while operable skylights vented accumulated heat. Dr. Martin Freeney, a researcher from the University of Adelaide in Australia, learned about Earthships through academic channels and flew to Taos to conduct independent verification. He wasn't a colleague of Reynolds, wasn't a client, had no financial stake in the outcome. He was a scientist interested in thermal performance of alternative buildings. Freeney installed hobo data loggers, precision instruments that recorded temperature, humidity, and other variables every 15 minutes around the clock in 6 Earthships at Greater World. He let the loggers run for months, through summer heat and winter cold, through the full range of conditions the high desert offered. His peer-reviewed findings, published between 2009 and 2013 in journals including Architectural Science Review and the Proceedings of the International Building Performance Simulation Association, documented what Earthship residents had experienced anecdotally for years. During the coldest week of winter, with outdoor temperatures plunging below 0 Fahrenheit, every monitored Earthship maintained indoor temperatures above 50 degrees without any supplemental heating. No furnace running, no space heaters glowing, no firewood burning. The walls alone, releasing stored solar energy, kept the homes livable. The modern, global model designs, Reynolds's refined versions incorporating 3 decades of lessons learned, performed even better. They stayed above 61 degrees through the same conditions. The best performers never dropped below 64. The critics had predicted frozen pipes. They'd predicted unlivable conditions. They'd predicted that Reynolds's thermal mass calculations were fantasy, that the walls couldn't possibly store and release enough energy to maintain comfort through extended cold snaps. The data loggers, impartial and precise, recorded otherwise. But data alone didn't change regulations. Legislators needed political cover to vote for something unconventional. They needed assurance that supporting experimental housing wouldn't generate outraged constituents demanding to know why the state was endorsing garbage houses built by a disgraced architect who'd lost his license and lost lawsuits and been threatened with jail. Reynolds found sponsors willing to take the risk. State Representative Bobby Gonzalez, who represented parts of northern New Mexico, agreed to champion the cause. Senator Carlos Cisneros signed on. The bill took shape over multiple drafts. House Bill 269, the Sustainable Development Testing Site Act. The concept was far narrower than Reynolds wanted. He'd proposed 200 acres of exemption from building codes, space enough to experiment freely, to demonstrate his methods at meaningful scale, to build an entire community that functioned completely off-grid and prove once and for all that his vision worked. The legislature countered with 2 acres, not a community, a testing site. Limited permits, renewable in 5-year terms. Counties would have to opt in voluntarily. Nothing forced any jurisdiction to accept experimental buildings if local officials chose not to. Nothing mandatory, nothing that compelled anyone to do anything. 2 acres. After requesting 200, Reynolds received 1% of what he'd proposed. He took it. In March 2007, the governor signed House Bill 269 into law. The Sustainable Development Testing Site Act took effect July 1st. For the first time in American history, a state had created explicit legal space for experimental sustainable construction that didn't fit existing building codes. Reynolds's Earthships weren't legal everywhere, but they were legal somewhere by statute with formal protection. After 37 years of building outside the system, he had a toehold inside it. The same year, the State Architects Board reinstated his license. 17 years after surrendering it under threat of malpractice prosecution, Reynolds was officially an architect again in New Mexico, though he never bothered reapplying. "I don't need to be an architect to do what I'm doing," he explained. He held active licenses in Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, Puerto Rico, New York, and Canada. The New Mexico reinstatement mattered symbolically. The legislation mattered structurally. Also in 2007, a documentary called Garbage Warrior premiered at film festivals around the world. Director Oliver Hodge had spent 3 years following Reynolds through the darkest period: the lawsuits, the county crackdowns, the depression, the endless lobbying trips to Santa Fe that seemed destined to fail. The film captured everything: Reynolds pounding tires in the desert, Reynolds testifying before skeptical legislative committees, Reynolds sitting alone admitting he'd nearly given up, Reynolds refusing to give up anyway. The film won the Vancouver International Film Festival Audience Award. It won the Ecofilm Grand Jury Prize and Audience Award. It earned 3 British Independent Film Award nominations. Suddenly, the architect who'd been treated as a local nuisance, whose license had been stripped, whose neighbours had condemned him, whose county had tried to jail him, became an international figure. Speaking invitations arrived from architecture schools, environmental conferences, and disaster relief organisations on 3 continents. The ugly duckling was becoming something else. The American Institute of Architects, the same professional body that accredited architecture programs, set ethical standards, and represented everything conventional in the field, invited Reynolds to lecture at their Colorado headquarters. Reynolds accepted. He stood before rows of credentialed professionals, the kind of people who had once dismissed him, who had enforced the codes that nearly destroyed him, who had called his methods dangerous and his buildings violations. He told them what he'd learned across 50 years. "I was the ugly duckling for 50 years, he said. I was ridiculed. They took my license and damn near put me in jail. And then they start realizing that what we're doing is relevant to where the world is heading." He paused, letting the silence hold. "And now we're turning into a swan." But vindication in lecture halls and film festivals meant nothing without vindication in the physical world. The Earthships had proven themselves in normal winters. They demonstrated efficiency under typical conditions: cold snaps that lasted days, temperature swings from blazing afternoon to freezing midnight, the routine extremes of high desert life. What they hadn't faced was catastrophe, true crisis, the kind of test that separated theoretical success from actual survival. Skeptics still wondered, what happens when everything fails at once? When the grid collapses, when the temperature plunges beyond normal ranges, when the systems face pressure they were never specifically designed to handle. Reynolds claimed his buildings could sustain life through any emergency. He claimed they were vessels, Earthships, capable of weathering whatever the planet threw at them. But claims require proof, and proof requires a test that nobody would choose, that nobody could schedule, that arrives only when nature or disaster decides. In the high desert of New Mexico, Reynolds continued building, continued teaching, continued refining. And he waited. Somewhere in the world, something always went wrong. What he didn't know was that the test was already coming. The first true test came not from nature, but from crisis half a world away. On December 26, 2004, an undersea earthquake off the coast of Sumatra generated a tsunami that killed over 230,000 people across 14 countries. The waves obliterated coastal villages throughout the Indian Ocean. In the Andaman Islands, an Indian territory in the Bay of Bengal, entire communities disappeared. Survivors who'd lost everything huddled in temporary shelters with no clean water, no sanitation, no protection from monsoons that would arrive within months. Reynolds received a call from relief coordinators who'd seen his work. Could Earthship techniques help? Could structures be built quickly from local materials by untrained labor? Could they provide the basic necessities, shelter, water, sanitation, without requiring infrastructure that no longer existed? Reynolds flew to the Andamans in early 2005. He brought no construction crew, no heavy equipment, no shipping containers of specialized materials. He brought knowledge. Within 2 weeks, working alongside local villagers who'd never heard of Earthships, Reynolds helped construct a community building from tires salvaged from the debris and bottles collected from the wreckage. The structure wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was functional. The walls provided thermal mass in a climate that swung between scorching days and cool nights. The roof channeled rainwater into collection tanks. The design demonstrated that sustainable building didn't require wealth or expertise or imported materials, only understanding. The building still stands. Locals continue using the rainwater collection system Reynolds taught them to build. A technique developed in the New Mexico desert proved adaptable to tropical islands 8,000 miles away. But the Andamans were a proof of concept, not a stress test. The structures faced normal conditions in a forgiving climate. The real validation would require something more extreme. It arrived in the winter of 2011. A polar vortex descended on the American Southwest, pushing temperatures across New Mexico to levels not seen in decades. In Taos County, the mercury dropped to 18 degrees below zero. Pipes burst throughout the region. Furnaces ran continuously, burning through propane tanks in days rather than weeks. Utility bills for January alone exceeded what some households normally paid in 3 months. The elderly and the poor faced impossible choices between heating and eating. At Greater World, the Earthship community northwest of Taos, residents experienced something different. Kirsten Jacobson had moved into her Earthship 3 years earlier, drawn by the promise of independence from utility companies and the grid they controlled. She'd been skeptical at first. The claims seemed too good to be true, but the economics were undeniable. Her previous home in town had cost $200 monthly just for heating. The Earthship cost nothing. When the polar vortex hit, Jacobson watched her neighbor's chimneys pour smoke around the clock. She watched propane trucks labor up icy roads to refill tanks that had emptied in days. She watched the news coverage of burst pipes and frozen families and heating assistance programs overwhelmed with applications. Inside her tire-walled home, the temperature held at 64 degrees. No furnace, no backup heater, no fire in the wood stove she kept for emergencies but had never needed. Just the thermal mass doing what thermal mass does, releasing the sun's stored energy slowly, steadily, through the longest nights. She walked to her interior greenhouse where banana trees and tomato plants grew in soil fed by her own grey water, and picked breakfast. Outside, the world was frozen. Inside, she was harvesting fruit. The monitoring equipment Dr. Freeney had installed years earlier recorded everything. The data showed what Jacobson experienced. While outdoor temperatures plunged to -18, the 6 monitored Earthships maintained indoor temperatures between 50 and 67 degrees without any supplemental heating. The modern global model designs perform best, never dropping below 61 even at the coldest hour of the coldest night. Conventional homes in Taos County consumed an average of $800 in heating fuel that January alone. Earthship residents consumed zero. The numbers didn't lie. The numbers couldn't be argued with. The numbers said exactly what Reynolds had claimed for 30 years. A house built from garbage could outperform a house built from lumber and drywall and conventional wisdom. But numbers on a page didn't capture what the residents felt. They felt warm while their neighbors shivered. They felt secure while utility companies sent disconnect notices to customers who couldn't pay surge-priced bills. They felt vindicated, and vindication, after years of being dismissed as eccentrics living in tire houses, tasted sweet. The validation compounded over the following years, each disaster adding evidence to the case Reynolds had built. In 2010, a magnitude 7 earthquake devastated Haiti, killing over 200,000 people and leaving 1 million homeless. The international relief effort struggled with the same problems that plagued every disaster response: how to shelter survivors quickly, cheaply, and durably using materials available in a shattered economy. Reynolds and his team arrived weeks after the quake. They found exactly what they expected: mountains of debris, including thousands of tires from destroyed vehicles, and desperate need for structures that could be built without heavy equipment or skilled labor. In 4 days, working with 40 local volunteers ranging in age from 4 to 50, they constructed a prototype shelter using 120 salvaged tires. The structure measured 120 square feet, small but large enough to shelter a family. The cost between $2,000 and $5,000 depending on finish level. The labor, entirely local, entirely untrained before the project began, entirely capable of replicating the process without outside help. The prototype demonstrated something crucial. Earthship techniques could be taught to anyone in hours, not years. The skills weren't specialized, the materials were free. The results were earthquake-resistant. The flexible tire walls absorbed seismic energy rather than cracking like concrete or collapsing like unreinforced masonry. CNN covered the Haiti project. The coverage reached audiences who'd never heard of Earthships, who'd never considered that housing could be built from waste, who'd assumed that sustainable living required wealth and technology rather than sledgehammers and discarded rubber. In 2015, Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded, struck the Philippines, killing over 6,000 people and displacing millions. Reynolds' team traveled to Leyte Island, where entire towns had been flattened by winds exceeding 190 miles per hour. They built what they called a windship, an aerodynamic variant designed specifically for typhoon resistance. The structure served as both school and storm shelter, its curved walls deflecting wind rather than resisting it, its tire and earth mass anchoring it against forces that had torn conventional buildings from their foundations. 3 years later, the windship remained fully functional. It had weathered subsequent typhoons without damage. Local educators used it daily. The community that had lost everything in Haiyan had gained something that couldn't be blown away. In 2018, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, killing nearly 3,000 people and leaving the entire island without power for months. The grid, the infrastructure that conventional homes depended on absolutely, had failed completely. Families with beautiful houses and modern appliances found themselves unable to cook, unable to refrigerate food, unable to pump water, unable to do anything that required electricity. Reynolds saw an opportunity to demonstrate what off-grid truly meant. Construction began in February 2018 in Aguada, on Puerto Rico's western coast. The design incorporated 5 geodesic domes built from tires packed with 300 pounds of earth each, the same technique Reynolds had developed in Taos, adapted for Caribbean conditions. Over 70 international volunteers participated, working alongside local Puerto Ricans who received full scholarships to attend the Earthship Academy in Taos afterward. The completed structure functioned as a community center, a place where people could gather, charge devices from solar panels, access clean water from rainwater collection, and experience what resilience actually looked like. When the next hurricane threatened, it would serve as a shelter. When the grid failed again, and in Puerto Rico the grid always failed again, it would continue operating as though nothing had happened. The building didn't require the grid. It didn't require municipal water. It didn't require anything from infrastructure that had proven, catastrophically, that it couldn't be trusted. Back in Taos, the skeptics faced a reckoning. Dave DiCicco, the planning director who'd issued stop work orders and threatened $500 daily fines, had long since left his position. The county's official stance had evolved from opposition to accommodation. Greater World was now formally designated an unconventional subdivision, a legal category that hadn't existed before Reynolds forced its creation. Earthships could be built there with permits, inspections, and official approval. The Valdez Acequia Commission still existed, the acequias still flowed. But the complaints about Earthships violating the land had faded as the structures proved themselves season after season, as the predicted disasters failed to materialize, as the community stabilized rather than degraded. Jeff Bryce, who'd called Reynolds' project the greatest violation of land ever done in the Taos Valley, never publicly recanted. Neither did Connie Espinoza, who'd found the glass walls ugly and inappropriate. But their voices had grown quiet. The Earthships remained visible from their properties, still gleaming, still unconventional, still announcing themselves across the mesa. The difference was that now they announced success rather than controversy. The architecture profession's response was more complex. Reynolds had been treated as a pariah, a disgrace, an example of what happened when architects ignored codes and cut corners. Now he received invitations to lecture at the institutions that trained architects, to speak at conferences where building codes were written, to consult on projects that required sustainable design. The American Institute of Architects' invitation to their Colorado headquarters marked a turning point. Reynolds stood before an audience of credentialed professionals and described decades of persecution followed by validation. The whole thing was so unorthodox, he said. Now it's being accepted, and with global warming, everyone is embracing it. But when I first started building, it was just too radical. He paused, considering how to summarize 40 years of struggle. Now I'm getting praise for the work I was getting crucified for. I was just doing it too early, I guess. The licensing board that had stripped his credentials in 1990 had restored them in 2007. Reynolds never reapplied in New Mexico. He didn't need state permission to do what he was doing, but he maintained active licenses in 6 other jurisdictions. The professional establishment that had tried to destroy him had been forced to acknowledge him. Former clients who'd filed complaints or lawsuits remained silent. The Suzanne Martin case had been settled years earlier. Whatever problems her Earthship had experienced, whatever failures had justified the judgment against Reynolds, they belonged to an earlier era of design. The global model that emerged from those painful lessons performed better than anything Reynolds had built before. Failure had been the teacher. The buildings that followed were the graduates. The media coverage shifted from skeptical to celebratory. The New York Times included Reynolds in a feature on eco-heroes. Architecture magazines that had ignored or dismissed his work began publishing profiles and project features. Documentary crews arrived regularly, filming the community, interviewing residents, capturing the strange beauty of bottle walls glowing in afternoon light. The ultimate validation came from the market. Earthships that Reynolds had struggled to sell in the 1980s and 90s now commanded premium prices. The Atlantis, a 3-acre property completed in 2023, listed for $900,000. The Refuge, a 1,600-square-foot global model finished in 2024, sold for $550,000. Properties that county officials had once threatened to condemn now attracted buyers who waited years for available lots. Greater World had grown to over 100 completed homes, sheltering more than 130 full-time residents. The community governed itself through a board of directors, collected modest annual dues, and maintained common areas and access roads that had long since been upgraded from the gullies Joey Townsend had complained about decades earlier. The spread extended far beyond Taos. Earthships now stood in all 50 American states. They'd been built in more than 40 countries across 6 continents. The total count exceeded 3,000 structures worldwide, each one a testament to techniques that regulatory authorities had once called dangerous, that engineers had called unproven, that neighbors had called eyesores. Reynolds turned 80 years old, still swinging a sledgehammer. The Earthship Academy he'd founded trained over 1,500 students from every continent, teaching the techniques he'd developed across 5 decades. Western Colorado University granted graduate credit for the program. Participants paid $950 for a week of intensive instruction, learning to pound tires and lay cans and plumb greywater systems under Reynolds' direct supervision. He still taught classes personally. He still worked construction sites when his schedule permitted. He still refined the designs, incorporating lessons from each new project, each new climate, each new challenge. The diagnosis had come years earlier: cancer. Reynolds chose to fight it holistically without conventional treatment, applying the same skepticism toward medical orthodoxy that he'd applied toward architectural orthodoxy. According to the Taos News, he'd been fighting cancer holistically with success, though success, like everything in Reynolds' life, was defined on his own terms. His philosophy had never wavered. The current definition of architecture is about buildings, and it's kind of about architects, in my opinion, and not about people, he explained in interviews. Architecture needs to be by and for people. His mentor remained a tree. His mission remained unchanged: buildings that encounter the phenomena of the planet to make sustenance. The COVID-19 pandemic had provided unexpected validation. When lockdowns began in 2020, when supply chains fractured, when grocery stores ran short and utility bills spiked, and millions found themselves dependent on systems that suddenly seemed fragile, Reynolds watched from his Earthship with something approaching satisfaction. There were people, even wealthy people, waiting in line for food, he observed. Homes became unlivable because the grid failed. He gestured toward his interior greenhouse, where banana trees heavy with fruit arched over grey-water-fed planters. Meanwhile, I was walking down my hallway barefoot, harvesting bananas. The image captured everything: independence, resilience, vindication. While the world discovered how vulnerable conventional life had become, the man who'd spent 50 years building an alternative lived exactly as he'd always lived: comfortable, fed, free. On a winter morning in Taos County, the temperature outside hovers near zero. Frost patterns the windows of conventional homes throughout the valley. Furnaces cycle on and off, burning propane, burning money, burning through fuel that will need replacement before spring. 14 miles northwest of town, on 630 acres of high desert mesa, over 100 structures built from automobile tires and aluminum cans and glass bottles face the rising sun. Their south-facing walls, angled glass over interior greenhouses where tropical plants grow in soil fed by recycled water, begin absorbing the day's first radiation. The thermal mass of their walls, over 200,000 pounds per home, starts storing heat that will release through the coming night. Inside one of these structures, an old man with weathered hands and a half-century of vindication walks barefoot across a tile floor, warmed by nothing but physics. He passes banana trees and tomato vines. He passes bottle walls that glow blue and green and amber in the early light. He passes tire walls plastered smooth, walls that building inspectors once refused to certify, that engineers once called dangerous, that neighbors once called ugly. The thermostat reads 68 degrees. It read 68 degrees yesterday. It will read 68 degrees tomorrow. No furnace, no utility bill, no dependence on systems that can fail, that have failed, that will fail again. Michael Reynolds pauses at his greenhouse window and looks out across the mesa. He can see other Earthships in the distance, their glass faces catching the sun, their occupants waking to the same warmth he feels. A community that authorities tried to shut down, homes that professionals called violations. A vision that took 50 years to vindicate. I was the ugly duckling, he'd said, and now we're turning into a swan. Outside, the wind pushes against the glass. The temperature drops another degree. Across Taos County, furnaces kick on, space heaters glow orange, and neighbors layer blankets over blankets. Inside the house made of garbage, the architect harvests breakfast and waits for nothing.